New Jersey worker history goes from the early agricultural period through to today's service economy, but the union movement really developed and became strong and powerful during the industrial period. And there's no better place to study the industrial period in America than in Paterson. In Paterson, the first American industries were developed. Alexander Hamilton and friends designed and financed the construction of Paterson to take advantage of the waters of the Great Falls. They channeled them so that they would come through in raceways that would run through factories such as the one behind me. And they saw Paterson as a way that America could become a powerful industrial country. Now the workers who worked here had a slightly different point of view about what was going on here. Workers in Paterson have been striking since the very, very earliest years. In 1835, when child workers worked for 13.5-hour days, 2,000 of them struck in 1835 to demand that their daily hours be cut to 11 hours a day. There were further massive strikes in the 1850s and later, and in 1913, one of the most famous strikes in American history, the Great Paterson Silk Strike, took place right here where we're speaking today. It did not end there. In 1934, there was a very militant textile strike in the city, and Paterson has continued to be in the forefront of American industrial cities. Now, unfortunately, as with most other industrial cities, Paterson has also suffered from deindustrialization in recent decades. Some of the factory buildings have been reused as condos and so on. Others stand empty, and some of them have fallen into ruins. But Paterson remains an amazing place to study American industry and American worker history. The industrial age is not over. All the products that we use, our clothing, our cars, our cell phones, they're all made by someone somewhere. It's just that even though the industrial age is still really with us, it occurs more in places like China and Mexico than it does in places like Paterson. Although there are still about 250,000 industrial workers in New Jersey today, so it is still an important part of our economy. After that short introduction from Paterson, I'd like to go over a few topics that you should look out for as you read and view the materials for the next 3 weeks in this module about the industrial period in New Jersey labor history, and about Paterson in particular. The first of these topics is the development of the factory system. As we learned last week, the early workshops in New Jersey, what they look like is you had a master that was a master artisan who ran the workshop. He had a couple of journeymen and apprentices typically employed by him. And they made the goods entirely from beginning to end. They would make whatever it is, shoes or chairs or whatever. And one of the leading philosophers of economics around this time was Adam Smith, who wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. And in this book, one of the most important points that he talked about was the introduction of the division of labor. What he argued was that if a particular work process could be broken up into its component parts, and then each of those parts given to different workers to do repeatedly over and over again, that they would become much more efficient at performing each of these specific tasks, and that altogether the productivity of the workshop would increase tremendously. So many early manufacturers in New Jersey, who often started out as masters, who were more successful than some of the other masters in the area. Maybe they were able to hire a few more journeymen. What some of them tried experimenting with was using this idea of the division of labor, and they would split up whatever their craft was. They would begin to split that up into multiple steps and then give different journeymen each of those steps to do. Well, what they found was that they didn't have to hire relatively expensive journeymen. They could hire people that were really fairly unskilled and just train them in that one task to do over and over again. So some of these masters who were the new manufacturers became very successful at this. They were able to increase productivity, undersell their competitors, continue growing. So at first we see that this process didn't really involve mechanization necessarily, it just involved the division of labor. What they next tried was mechanizing some parts of that process. So to go back to our pin making example, perhaps out of those 18 operations, maybe 3 or 4 of those were ones that could be automated with some kind of simple machinery. And so as the manufacturers started adding machinery to handle various steps of the process, they were able to again further increase their production more and more over time. So this was good in many ways for the economy as a whole. It was certainly good for the new manufacturers. Some of them became very wealthy. The productivity of the country increased. But it was a bit more complicated for the workers who were doing these various tasks because they no longer had to be skilled artisans with many years of training. They could be paid a lot less. If they didn't like the pay, they could be thrown out in the street, and someone who's unemployed, perhaps a new immigrant just off the boat, could be brought in and trained in a few days to do the process. So the conditions for the workers in these factories that grew larger and larger and soon became pretty massive in some cases became one of long, hard, grueling days with very low pay and a very unstable lifestyle. When demand was high, employers would demand that workers work 12, 14-hour days, 6 or 7 days a week. And when demand was low, they would lay them off without any notice at all, and workers had no idea of when they would be called back to work, or if they would in fact be called back to work. And of course there was no unemployment compensation at this time, so it was a tough life for the workers in these factories. So that's the first topic, the development of the factory system. The second topic flows directly from this, and that's the development of industrial unions. Now, we saw in the previous module the development of some of the early trade unions that were built by journeyman artisans who built unions for their specific crafts. So, for instance, the carpenters or shoemakers would create a union just for people that were expert at that craft. And they limited the membership of who could join. They controlled what the practices and procedures would be for each of these crafts. And their basic goal was to try to maintain that old master journeyman artisan system, and so because they hoped someday to become masters themselves. Well, as time went on, even many of these unions began to change because the factory system began to overpower the artisanal system, although artisans certainly remained in some areas and still remain today, but much more manufacture was taken over by the new factory system. So workers in these factories faced a more difficult situation than the artisans did. The artisans had a valuable skill, and if they withheld that skill from their employers, they were in a pretty strong position, and they could often win their demands. For many of the unskilled workers, they experimented with a different kind of unionism. Unlike the craft unionism that we looked at before, this one is known as industrial unionism. And it has the name industrial unionism, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this was the kind of unionism that happened in industry in particular. This particular use of the term means that all the workers in a workplace would be organized together in the same union. So if you had a factory of 100 workers, maybe 5 or 10 of those were skilled workers that were still required. If you had craft unions, you might have those skilled workers in the union, and maybe the other workers would be in the union, but most likely not. But with an industrial union, regardless of what job anyone did, everyone would be in the same union. It didn't mean they all got the same pay, but they would all be in the same union, and they would all back each other up. They would all go out on strike together or not. And so what they counted on was they would be able to work out all the differences among the employees of these factories, the differences by ethnicity, gender, race, skill level, And if they could get all these workers to unite in solidarity together, then they would be somewhat in a strong position. However, even if all the workers went on strike, the employers could bring in a whole new workforce. So what industrial unionists had to do is not only get everyone together, or close to everyone together in the same union, but they also, if they decided that they needed to go on strike, they also needed to prevent replacement workers, strike breakers, what they called scabs, from moving into their old jobs and taking their jobs. So they often would have strong picket lines walking up and down in front of a struck factory, and they would try to physically prevent any strike breakers from going through the line to go into work. So they had a much tougher job ahead of them in having successful unions. And perhaps because of this, the first couple examples of industrial unionism in New Jersey, while they were very successful for a time, in the long run, they did not survive more than a decade or two.